I cut the power to my own condo. I was sitting in my car in the parking garage 2 floors below, watching the building's app on my phone. One tap. That was all it took. The smart panel went dark, the thermostat dropped, and the Bluetooth lock on the front door switched to access denied mode. My brother and his wife were up there somewhere in the blackout, probably stumbling around looking for a light switch that wouldn't help them. They didn't know I'd spent the last 4 months turning that apartment into a trap, and they walked right into it. Let me back up. I bought my condo in Mississauga when I was 28. It wasn't glamorous. A one-bedroom plus den on the 9th floor of a building near Square One, close enough to the Geo station that I could hear trains in the morning, but it was mine. I'd saved for 6 years, lived with 2 roommates through most of my mid-20s, eaten enough sad desk lunches to last a lifetime, and finally scraped together enough for the down payment on something with my name on the deed. Just my name. Nobody else's. I work in financial compliance for a mid-sized firm downtown Toronto. My job, essentially, is to find things people are trying to hide. Discrepancies in accounts. Paper trails that don't add up. Signatures that don't add up. Signatures that don't match. I'm good at it. I mention this because it matters later. It matters a lot. My brother is 4 years older than me. Growing up, he was the one who got the car for his 16th birthday, and I got a card with $20 in it. He was the one who got his university tuition covered, and I took out OSAP loans I didn't finish paying off until I was 31. I don't say this with bitterness anymore. I made peace with the scoreboard a long time ago. But the pattern was there, and I should have recognized it faster when it started repeating itself. His name is Brett. His wife's name is Courtney. They got married 5 years ago at a venue in Niagara-on-the-Lake that my parents co-signed a second loan to help pay for, which I only found out about 18 months later when my mother mentioned it sideways during a phone call. They have a habit, the two of them, of expanding into whatever space is offered to them. Give them an inch, and they will, without any apparent guilt, take everything they can reach. It started with a favor. Brett called me in October 2 years ago. He and Courtney had just moved back from Calgary. His company had relocated him and then, 14 months later, laid him off. They were staying with my parents temporarily in Brampton while they figured out next steps. Could they stay at my place for a few weeks while they apartment hunted in the city? They wanted to be closer to downtown for job interviews. A few weeks. That was the phrase he used. I said yes because he's my brother, and because a few weeks sounded manageable. I was in the middle of a long audit project that had me working late most nights anyway. I gave him my spare key, told him the building's visitor parking rules, reminded him to be quiet after 10 because my neighbor downstairs worked nights. I didn't charge him rent. I figured I was doing something good for family. By December, they were still there. Brett had found some contract work, remote, decent hourly rate. Courtney was doing something with online resale. They were, quote, almost ready to sign on a place in East York. Just a couple more weeks. I let it go. I was busy. The holidays came and I spent most of them at my parents' place anyway, so I wasn't home much to notice how settled they'd gotten. What I did notice, when I stayed over at my own apartment on the 27th of December, was that the closet in the den was full of Courtney's clothes. My gym equipment had been moved into a corner and covered with a moving blanket. There was a secondary Wi-Fi router plugged into the wall that I hadn't put there. I mentioned it, gently, in the new year. Brett said they'd found a place and were just waiting on the landlord to confirm the lease date, probably mid-February. Mid-February came and went. Then it was March, then it was May. Every time I pushed, there was a new reason. Paperwork delays, inspection issues, a landlord who suddenly wanted a larger damage deposit. I was hearing a different story every 3 weeks, and I was busy enough at work that I kept letting the timeline slide. What changed everything was a call from my building's property management office in June. They wanted to confirm that I had authorized an additional name to be added to the unit's emergency contact and mail delivery record. The name on file was Courtney's. I had not authorized that. When I asked who submitted the request, they said it had come in through the online resident portal from my account. I went very still in my desk chair when I heard that. I asked them to flag the request as unauthorized and not process it. Then I hung up and sat there for a long moment, thinking about what it means when someone uses your login to start putting their name on documents attached to your home. I didn't confront them. This is the part people always push back on when I tell this story, and I understand why it looks passive. But I knew from my work that if you tip someone off that you know, they get careful. They move things. They cover tracks. They start narratives. I needed to understand the full picture before I moved, so I started looking. I pulled my bank records first. I'd given Brett a secondary credit card on one of my accounts, a card I'd added him to when he first arrived so he could buy groceries for the unit without me having to transfer money back and forth. I'd forgotten to remove him when the weeks turned into months. When I actually looked at the statements, I found 8 months of charges I hadn't fully registered. Grocery runs that were too large for 2 people, and meals at restaurants I'd never been to. Just over $4,000 in total. Then I checked the utility accounts. My electricity usage, per the online portal, had jumped 38% in the 7 months since Brett and Courtney moved in. There was also a record of a call placed to the provider in February. Someone had called in, apparently from my unit, to ask about adding a secondary billing name. The rep had told them they'd need a form signed by the primary account holder. No form had ever come to me. I pulled the building's visitor log. Most buildings keep them now, digital records of fob access and visitor badge sign-ins. I requested mine through the property manager, framing it as a security concern related to an unauthorized portal access. What I got back showed that Brett and Courtney had been signing in guests, sometimes 8 or 10 at a time on weekends. People I didn't know, events I hadn't been told about. Then I found the email. I still had Brett copied on a building newsletter list from when he first arrived. I'd added him so he'd know about maintenance windows and parking changes. In March, someone had replied to one of those newsletters asking about available units in the building. Brett had replied from his own email saying he co-owned a unit on the 9th floor and could answer questions about the building. Co-owned, I took a screenshot. I saved it into a folder I labeled, very professionally, documentation. Over the next 6 weeks, I built that folder into something substantial. Every charge, every utility record, every log entry. I photographed the den closet, Courtney's skincare shelf that had colonized my bathroom, the secondary router, the shelf in the kitchen where Brett had stored what appeared to be merchandise for Courtney's resale business, small electronics, still in packaging. I did all of this quietly, over time, without changing my behavior toward either of them. I also consulted a lawyer, a real estate and tenancy lawyer in Toronto who, when I laid out the timeline and showed her the documentation, told me something I needed to hear clearly. In Ontario, if someone has been occupying a residential unit for more than a year with your knowledge and hasn't been paying rent, the situation can become legally complicated. Not impossible to resolve, but complicated. I needed to move carefully. She also told me what I did not need to do. I did not need to give them months of notice if they hadn't been operating as formal tenants under a signed lease. We reviewed everything together. No lease had ever been signed. No rent had ever been discussed, let alone paid. The original arrangement was a verbal house guest agreement for a few weeks. The lawyer's assessment was clear. What I did next, I planned over the course of about 3 weeks. I upgraded the building's smart panel access on my unit. I'd had a basic smart lock installed when I first moved in, but I'd never fully integrated it into the building's system. I paid to have a licensed electrician come in on a Tuesday when Brett and Courtney were both out to connect the panel, the thermostat, and the door lock to a single app with admin access that only existed on my devices. I told the building's property manager what I was doing and why, and gave her the documentation I'd been collecting. She was not surprised. She told me this wasn't the first time she'd seen something like this, and that the building would cooperate fully. I also contacted the police non-emergency line and spoke to an officer about the situation. Not to make a report at that point, just to ask questions. The officer I spoke to was helpful. She explained the distinction between a civil tenancy dispute and a situation involving unauthorized use of property, and given that there was no signed lease and that I had documentation of what appeared to be misuse of my accounts, she felt there was enough to justify a presence if I needed one when the time came. The time came on a Saturday in mid-September. Brett had mentioned, casually, the week before, that some friends were coming over on the weekend. His phrasing was, "We're having some people over." He said it like it was his apartment. He didn't ask. He didn't even frame it as a question. I said, "Okay," and made a mental note. I drove to my parents' place in Brampton that Saturday morning. I told my mother I wanted to talk to her and my father together. I showed them the folder, the charges, the email where Brett said he co-owned my unit, the utility records, the visitor logs. My mother's face went through several things in sequence. Disbelief, then a kind of recognition she clearly didn't want to have. Then something closer to grief. My father was quiet for a long time. I told them what I was going to do that night. My mother asked me to wait. She said maybe there was a misunderstanding. I asked her, as gently as I could, what part she thought was a misunderstanding. She didn't have an answer. My father told me I had the right to handle it as I saw fit. He looked exhausted. I think he'd seen something, or sensed it, and hadn't known what to do with it either. I drove back toward the city at around 4 in the afternoon. I didn't go home. I parked in the garage, 2 levels down, and I waited. At 9:17, I could hear music through the building's ambient sensor. I'd added a monitor as part of the smart panel upgrade. Nothing that recorded, just decibel levels. It was loud enough to register. I checked the visitor log in real time through the management app. 11 sign-ins between 7 and 9 p.m. 11 guests in my apartment for a party I hadn't been invited to. I opened the app. The first thing I turned off was the internet. The router in the unit dropped off, both the building-supplied one and the secondary one Brett had plugged in. A minute later, I turned the thermostat down to 16 degrees. In September in Ontario, 16 degrees inside feels cold fast. Then I switched the smart lock to admin-only mode, which meant the spare key Brett had could still physically turn the deadbolt, but the electronic latch, the one that controlled the door chain and the secondary bolt, wouldn't respond to anything except my phone. I waited 20 minutes. Then I called the police non-emergency line, referenced the file number from my earlier conversation, explained that I had unauthorized occupants in my property hosting an event, and asked if an officer could meet me at the building. The dispatcher was efficient. 2 officers arrived within about 40 minutes. I met them in the lobby. I showed them the deed on my phone. The PDF I kept in my cloud storage, along with my driver's license showing my address. I showed them the documentation folder, which I'd condensed into a clean summary with key records attached. One of the officers asked if there was a lease agreement. I said there was not. He asked how long the occupants had been there. I told him approximately 11 months. He looked at his partner briefly and then back at me and said they'd come up with me. We took the elevator. I knocked on my own door. It took almost a full minute for Brett to answer. When he opened the door, he was holding a drink and smiling at whoever was behind him, mid-sentence. And then he saw me and the 2 officers, and the smile didn't disappear so much as freeze, and then crack apart slowly, like ice in March. "Hey," he said. "We weren't expecting you." I said, "I know. I need everyone to leave, please." He started to say something about how this wasn't a great time, and maybe we could talk tomorrow and I should have let them know I was coming, and one of the officers, a very calm woman, maybe mid-40s, with the tone of someone who had seen every version of this conversation before, said, "Sir, this isn't your apartment. The leaseholder is asking you to clear the premises." Brett looked at me like I'd hit him. "You called the police on me? On your own brother?" I said. "I called the police to my own home." It took about 35 minutes to get everyone out. Most of the guests left quickly and without incident. They didn't know what was going on and clearly didn't want to be part of it. Courtney came out of the bedroom and stood very still when she saw the officers. She looked at me and then at the floor and didn't say anything for a while. My brother tried several things. He tried appealing to family. He said our mother would be devastated. I said I'd spoken to our mother that afternoon. That stopped him for a moment. He tried suggesting that I was being irrational and dramatic. The officers remained present and said nothing during this, which was somehow more effective than anything they could have said. He tried claiming he had rights as a long-term occupant. The officer who'd spoken at the door said that without a signed lease and without rent having been paid, the situation didn't meet the threshold for formal tenancy status under the Residential Tenancies Act, and that I was within my rights to require them to vacate as the sole owner of the property. Courtney asked if they could stay the night and get their things in the morning. I told her they could take what they needed tonight and arrange to collect the rest within 72 hours, with me present during a window I would schedule. The officer confirmed this was a reasonable arrangement. They left at 11:42. I know because the building log recorded the fob access at exit. I sat on my couch for a while after, in the quiet. The apartment smelled like other people. Food I didn't recognize. Someone's perfume. The particular staleness of a crowd in a closed space. I opened the balcony door even though it was cold. I sat there and listened to the city and felt something I hadn't felt in almost a year, which was the particular silence of a space that belongs to you. The following week, my lawyer sent Brett and Courtney a formal letter itemizing the unauthorized charges, the credit card use, the utility overages, the property management fees I'd incurred during the process. The total came to just over $6,000. Brett called me twice. The first call I let go to voicemail. The second, I answered and I let him say what he had to say, and then I told him that my lawyer would be the appropriate point of contact going forward, and that I genuinely wished him well. My mother called me 3 days later. She wasn't angry with me exactly, but she was sad in the way that mothers get when they realize they can't fix something. She asked if there was any way to handle the money differently, maybe work it out privately. I told her I understood why she was asking and that I'd taken the letter out of my lawyer's hands before it got sent to a collections firm, which was true because I had. I told her I didn't want to escalate. I wanted it acknowledged and settled, and that was it. It took 4 months, but Brett paid back $3,000 of the 6. We agreed, through our lawyers, to close the matter at that amount. I'm not going to pretend that was a perfect resolution because it wasn't. The number wasn't the point, not really. The point was the moment I sat in that parking garage with my phone in my hand and understood, fully, that I had built something for myself, and that I had every right to protect it. I changed all the locks the next morning. New smart panel, new fob codes, new everything. The locksmith took about 2 hours. I tipped him $20 and made him a coffee. Some people, when I've told this story, say I should have confronted Brett sooner, cut it off at 3 months instead of 11. Maybe, but I've spent enough time in rooms reviewing documents to know that a paper trail matters. I didn't want to win an argument. I wanted to be unassailable. I wanted there to be no version of events in which I was the person who overreacted, who couldn't prove it, who made a scene and had nothing to show for it. The folder is still on my desktop. I haven't deleted it. I don't know if I ever will. Not because I'm holding on to it, but because it's a record of the thing I built. Not just the documentation, but the patience. The careful, deliberate, unglamorous patience of someone who knew what she had and decided it was worth protecting properly. My name is on that deed. Nobody else's. And I'm not particularly interested in sharing that again.